Hello buddy, it's Wyvern here with another historical video. This time around we are going to be discussing a specific weapon once again, and that weapon is the Halberd. This was a video that was requested earlier in the comments, and I felt it was definitely worth touching on, especially in the wake of the Greatsword, which was in many ways a competitor weapon, or a weapon that sort of functioned and appeared on the battlefield at much the same time as the halberd, or really rose to prominence at much the same time as the halberd. We're going to be examining what exactly composes a halberd, because of course there are a lot of polearms. Polearms are a massive class of weapons, and a halberd is a specific subset of polearms. So we are going to be examining what exactly composes a halberd, what defines a halberd, and then examining, of course, its combat usage. The halberd did see quite a bit of service from right around the 14th century straight up through to even modern times. Perhaps most famously, the Swiss guards in the Vatican use the halberd as a ceremonial weapon. But even before then, the weapon saw significant service during the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, and even continued to see bodyguard as well as officer service right up until the late 18th century. So we're going to be examining that performance of the halberd, and finally, of course, as usual, comparing it to its Warhammer counterparts and how exactly it stacks up both in functionality as well as design and all those things. Now, if you guys have a specific historical topic you're interested in, certainly don't hesitate to post your request down below. I do read the comments, and if there's a specific point of interest, I'll certainly go and jot it down and examine it in a video. I certainly appreciate the feedback, and if there's specific things that interest you guys, don't hesitate to ask. Also, if you do have additional comments, critiques, or additional information to share, as usual, do not hesitate to post them down below. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to post those down below. And if you enjoyed the video, like, subscribe, and sign up for notifications. So do hope you guys enjoy. Without further ado, let's dive into the story of the halberd. Now, before we dive into the combat history and service history of the halberd, I think it is important, in much the same vein as our greatsword video, to define what exactly constitutes a halberd. What is a halberd? So we are all on the same page as to what weapon we are discussing. During the entirety of the medieval period, right up until even the early modern period to some extent, there was a wide array of different polearms utilized by a wide variety of different armies, nations, factions, units, and regions. And some of these weapons were, in fact, rather similar to the halberd in certain ways. Some of them are often confused with halberd. But whether these weapons be the volge, the gisarm, the bill, the poleaxe, or whatever, they are not the halberd. And I think it is important to get a definition down so we know exactly what weapon we were discussing. Now, the halberd was a polearm developed during the 14th century, or rather brought to the forefront during the 14th century by the Swiss in particular. And the name for the weapon is actually derived from the German words Halm and Barte, or handle and battle axe. When combined together, they form the word Halmbarte, and this is where the word halberd is derived from in English. And we see similar derivations made in other languages, whether the Czech halapartna, the Spanish alabarda, whatever it may be. We see similar sort of takes on this German word. And the halberd was a weapon that throughout most of its life cycle, or essentially really all of its life cycle, did maintain a relatively constant look. I would say more so than, for example, the greatsword we discussed before. And it was certainly sort of a unique or generally well-definable weapon. First and foremost, it was a polearm that had the length of roughly 1.5 to about 2.2 or so meters, 5 to 8 feet on average. Really, 8 feet would have been pushing the longer side of things. Generally, probably 5 to 7 was a more reasonable estimate, but certainly 5 to 8 feet was the general range for halberds. It was an incredibly versatile weapon, and this came down in part to the fact that it could function that it had so much reach, also to the way its head was designed. The head combined an axe blade on one end, providing it with great performance against lightly armored or unarmored troops. It allowed it to sort of deliver wide slashing blows. It also had a elongated spear tip or spike at the top that allowed it to jab or stab at enemies from a relatively safe distance. Now, certainly 5 to 8 feet is not in the ballpark of a pike or even a long spear, but certain spears would be in around the 10 or so foot length. But it was long enough to at least contend with these weapons and give you some decent reach, especially against an opponent armed with smaller or shorter weapons, such as poleaxes were often shorter weapons, or swords, or maces, or whatever. In comparison to those, Halberd had much more reach. And finally, the Halberd did have the rear spike, or the rear hook. And this allowed it to... Well, this gave it additional versatility against cavalry, against horsemen. The spike or hook allowed it to yank opponents from a horseback and drag them down to the ground, where they could then be clobbered to death by the infantry. It also allowed the weapon to be used to drag enemy shields or strike at opponents from a vertical angle. So the halberd could be deployed in a wide variety of ways, whether those be slashing attacks, jabbing attacks with the spearhead, or downwards strokes with the hook or spike at the end. That hook or spike at the end also gave it greater armor penetrating characteristics. The halberd's wide-bladed axe head was not necessarily great against armor. It could definitely be efficient against lower end or lighter armor varieties, but and being a smaller blade and a bit of and sort of a heavier blade, it was better than say a sword would be against armor, but certainly nowhere comparable to dedicated armor piercing weapons. And this is really where the rear spike would come in, that it would grant the user at least some efficiency against armor, especially if they were able to strike at an opponent's weak spots. Now, the halberd's evolution was relatively straightforward. The weapon stayed and retained this general look for essentially its whole life cycle. An axe head with a spear tip and a backward spike or a hook. However, the later variants of halberds often had a broader axe head. This was most likely due to the preponderance of lighter armored infantry and even cavalry in the later periods, due to the prominence in no small part of firearms, which negated a lot of armor. But the halberd, due to the lighter armor of most infantry formations during the time period, many of the later halberd designs did have a broader and larger axe head to make it more efficient against these lighter armored infantry. Now, late period halberds that were used by officers in, for example, the English army, sergeants utilized halberds right up until 1793. Halberds such as that were essentially a little more than ceremonial tools. They were more meant to direct the attention of troops, or direct the fire of the troops. More of a symbolic weapon of rank, rather, in much the same way as, for example, an officer's saber could be, rather than an actual dedicated weapon of war. And in these cases, many of the halberds were actually left unsharpened, and they were not really intended for combat usage. So that was also a interesting deviation. Albeit these halberds were very much a sort of far cry from intended purpose from the halberds utilized by the Swiss and German mercenaries in particular during the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. Now, one of the weapons most commonly associated or compared to a halberd is the poleaxe. Now, the two are in fact rather different weapons, but there's also a bit of overlap, and some of this, I think, boils down, and some of the confusion, I think, between the two does boil down to the fact that the halberd and poleaxe were differentiated a lot more specifically by later historians during the Victorian era, and after the halberd had in fact ceased to see real combat service, as well as the poleaxe for that matter. However, as a general rule of thumb, the poleaxe the poleaxe actually had quite a few differences. First and foremost, a poleaxe often was not actually even an axe. The head would often include rather consistently, in fact, include some sort of hammerhead. It was dedicated much more towards punching through or wounding opponents in armor. So the head on poleaxes was often essentially like designed in much the same manner as a Warhammer, designed to deliver blunt force concussive blows or perhaps punch through enemy armor, rather than for those wide slashing strikes of a halberd. Even poleaxes that did have a bladed head generally had a smaller bladed head. They were not really dedicated to this anti-infantry purpose. Halberds also usually had the head designed in one piece. This was partially because the weapons were cheap. Now, there was a clear class difference in who utilized halberds versus who utilized poleaxes. Halberds were usually the weapon of choice for infantrymen, for mercenaries, for peasant militias or town militias, rather than being a nobleman's weapon, which is what the poleaxe was. The poleaxe was a weapon utilized by wealthier individuals, and usually was a weapon commonly used by horsemen, by the nobility, often used in a tourney setting rather than an actual military setting, though it certainly could and was used in a military setting as well, and certainly had much more focus against armor than the halberd. And it also was built with more pieces. The head on a poleaxe would usually be more modular and composed of more parts than a halberd head, which was, as mentioned, simply one piece. Although this was not unique to the poleaxe would often have langettes and more reinforcement along the shaft so as to better protect it from enemy strikes. Halberds, which were often more cheaply manufactured and designed, often lacked these, especially early on. So that was definitely a difference. And finally, poleaxes varied a lot more in length than halberds did. Or I shouldn't say they varied a lot more in length. However, poleaxes had a much shorter minimum length than a halberd. Poleaxes could be as short as about four or so feet. The shorter variants of poleaxes would have actually been closer to a weapon such as a mace, rather than a polearm. And whereas essentially all halberds were decisively in the polearm category, they all ranged in that 5 to 6 to 7 foot range of length. And while there certainly were poleaxes that were that length, there was obviously a difference in intended use. Poleaxes meant for foot use were generally longer, whereas poleaxes intended for cavalry usage would have been shorter, so as to be more easily handled from horseback. However, it's important, I think, to make this distinction. And the poleaxes were probably the closest sort of comparison, and they are often conflated with the halberds. I think in historical texts, they are often actually, the exact line between halberd and poleaxe is not really explored too much. It's something that was more developed after the two weapons had already essentially expired from service. It is, however, worth noting that in many combat manuals from the period, there is much more prominence, or actually really almost all the prominence as far as polearms go is dedicated towards the poleaxe. Halberds are rather rare, if not non-existent, in these manuals and manuscripts in various forms of close quarters fighting. The poleaxe, being a nobleman's weapon or weapon for wealthier classes, had this benefit of dedicated literature as to how to properly be used. It would also appear that the poleaxe had a more exotic manner of usage. Much of the fighting described with the poleaxe does appear to be closer to the way one would wield a quarterstaff rather than the way one would wield an axe or a spear, which is what a halberd was more comparable to. So those are just some important differences, I think. A poleaxe would still often share the same spike and the same spear tip as a halberd would have. However, it was much more oriented towards against armor, often shorter, often more expensive, designed for nobility, and generally more defined in manuscripts and had combat styles more defined in manuscripts than the halberd. And there were other polearms. However, I don't think any of them really come as close in design to the halberd. The halberd's look is rather unique. You certainly see other weapons that are long bladed polearms, such as glaives. We certainly see long sort of hooking polearms, such as the bill. However, these often lack the spear tip, or some of them lack the hook. Whatever it may be, there's often a difference. And so I think really the closest to the poleaxe, and I think it's important to get that distinction out of the way. So with that difference, and with that discussion on differences and definitions out of the way, let us dive into the combat history of the halberd. Now, as we discuss the combat history of the halberd, we will really be focusing, most importantly, on the Swiss usage of the weapon, and to a lesser extent, the German and the English usage of the halberd. But however, when I make note of that, keep in mind that these were not the only nationalities to make use of the halberd. It was a relatively prominent and common weapon around much of Europe, and it saw service in a wide variety of capacities, whether in a significant sort of military service, or in a bodyguard or local town militia role, or even utilized by colonial forces and by the conquistadors and expeditions such as that. The halberd saw a wide variety of service and function. Certainly was not limited to these nations. However, some of its greatest highlights and sort of some of the greatest peaks in the halberd service life did occur in the hands of the Swiss, and to a lesser extent the English and the Germans. And it was also the tactics utilized by these nations were oftentimes the tactics that would have been utilized by other European nations using the halberd as well. So it does give us a safe point of reference, or stable point of reference, as to how the halberds were used. Now, the Swiss were the earliest adopters of the halberd in significant numbers. When exactly this happened is somewhat disputed, and not really possible to ascertain with any degree of certainty. It's kind of difficult to know when exactly the halberd rose to prominence. Most likely sometime around the late 13th to early 14th century, perhaps as late as the mid 14th century. However, the earliest significant engagement for the halberd was most likely the Battle of Morgarten. Historian John Gilmartin, in fact, associates this battle with the rise of the halberd as well as the pike as the preeminent weapon of the Swiss soldiery. And in this battle, it was a conflict stimulated in large part by tensions between the Swiss Confederacy as well as the Austrian Habsburgs over claims made to the crown of the Holy Roman Emperor. The Swiss Confederates did support Duke Louis IV of Bavaria, whereas the Habsburgs supported Frederick the Handsome, who was himself a Habsburg. So obviously he had their support. However, the resulting as a result of this, tensions flared up, and the Habsburgs deployed a significant force of approximately 2,000 to 3,000 knights and men-at-arms to suppress the rebellious Swiss Confederates. Now, what exactly the percentages of knights or men-at-arms in this army were is not exactly known. It's somewhat disputed. However, what is rather well established is the fact that it was a well-trained and well-equipped force. Now, in comparison, the Swiss were not of the same quality that is generally accepted. Now, what the exact numbers of the Swiss were are hotly contested. Some claim the Swiss were outnumbered, and of course this goes well along with sort of tale of the outnumbered and downtrodden Swiss fighting against all odds to win. There are claims of Swiss numbers being as low as 1,500. Generally, a number somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 is more widely accepted. However, regardless, the fact of the matter was the Swiss troops were significantly worse off when it came to arms and training in comparison to their Habsburg peers. However, they did have the advantage of terrain in particular. At the Battle of Morgarten, it took place between Morgarten Pass and Lake Egersee. The Swiss managed to bait the Austrian forces into an incredibly inconvenient battlefield. They barricaded the pass off with a mixture of logs as well as boulders, and the Austrians allowed themselves to be funneled in, crammed, and compacted into a very tight area. And in the midst of being packed in between the steep slope of the pass as well as the swamps and bogs making up the shores of Lake Egersee, the Swiss began their onslaught. They launched boulders as well as logs. They rolled them down at the Austrians, and as well as firing significant amounts of projectiles from arrows at the Austrians, and finally closing the gap and storming them with halberds as well as spears or pikes. Whether or not these were exactly long spears or pikes is somewhat contested, and it is a little difficult to ascertain based on period sources. However, what is known is that these weapons did make an appearance, and supposedly excuse me, historian John Gilmartin associates the success of the Swiss in this battle with their widespread adoption of the halberd, as they found that the halberd could in fact counteract well-armored men-at-arms. Now, as I previously mentioned, the halberd was not a great anti-armor tool. However, keep in mind that it was not an amazing anti-armor tool in, say, the vein of a poleaxe. However, keep in mind that in the period of the early 14th century, armor was not at its zenith. It was not at its peak as it would be during the 15th and 16th centuries. So at this stage, the halberd was a much more efficient and much more effective anti-armor tool than it would be later on. And in fact, this was one of the issues that would spur the development of more specialized anti-armor weapons than the halberd. So at the time, it makes sense that the halberd would have been an efficient anti-armor tool. Much like the longbow during the early 14th century was relatively effective against the armor of the time, where it would lose much of its efficiency by the end of the century. So do keep in mind. Similarly, the Swiss found that the pike was rather effective, supposedly, in this engagement. Whatever the case may be, though, it is certain that the Swiss did make use of the weapon here. Now, there are depictions of this action in the Schachlandschronik, a illustrated chronicle, an illustrated Swiss chronicle that was published in 1470. However, do be wary when you see one of the things to keep in mind, especially when examining some of the images here from the Schachlandschronik, is the fact that many medieval and late Renaissance and early modern artists would take certain creative liberties when it came to depicting weapons and armor of historical engagements. They would oftentimes base their designs on armor and weaponry on the weapons and armor of the time. So as we can see here in some of the depictions, the prominence of a heavy plate and such armor in particular, as well as perhaps the prominence of pikes, which really supposedly became more popular with the Swiss later on in the 14th century, would suggest that at least some of the depiction is a bit suspect. Do keep this tendency in mind that while yes, historical depictions can be very useful, especially if they're made sometime around the time of the engagement being depicted, if they are reflecting on some historical event, the depiction can be misleading or can be inaccurate. So whether or not the halberds or the weapons of the time would have actually looked the way they are depicted here is somewhat debatable, and do keep that in mind as we look at these various historical imagery depicting the events that took place in 1315 or any of the later battles we discuss. Now, from this point on, the halberd did rise in popularity within the Swiss cantons. Now, throughout the remainder of the 14th century, the halberd really remained the primary polearm of the Swiss infantry. Now, to an extent, this was most likely a decision based on its well-established battle capabilities, proven most significantly at the Battle of Morgarten, where it proved effective at dealing with well-armored and equipped knights and men-at-arms. However, most likely, I would think some of it also boiled down to the unique terrain and combat situation in which Switzerland found itself engaged during the much of the 14th century. Fighting foreign invaders or during internal fighting, many of the battles took place in terrain that was not very conducive to pike warfare, as well as terrain where cavalry was not as effective as it could have been on other battlefields. And due to this, some of the halberd's big disadvantages were not really exploited, in my opinion, or weren't really made clear. The halberd's short reach was a significant disadvantage when attempting to defend against enemy cavalry. The halberd's short reach was also a problem when one attempted to fight formations armed with longer polearms, such as the pike, especially when your force was largely composed of lightly armored or more lightly armored infantry, which was the case for the Swiss, for many of the Swiss militias, for the forces that the Swiss cannons employed. These were not heavily armored men-at-arms and knights fighting on foot. These were, in many cases, unarmored or very lightly armored infantrymen. And the fact that in fact they oftentimes were not well equipped includes such examples such as the Battle of Sempach, perhaps one of the great examples of the halberds usage, where supposedly many of the Swiss troops only had a wooden shield as their only protection, a wooden plank supposedly they were using as a shield, which was definitely indicate that their state of armor was not exactly great. Now, the Battle of Sempach, in many depictions, granted these are once again later depictions, such as some great woodcuts by Niklaus Manuel from 1530, we can see the Swiss depicted wielding masses of halberds. We can see that it is what appears to be their primary weapon. Now, whether or not these depictions are 100% accurate, that is up for a bit of debate. The pike was certainly growing in popularity into the later half of the 14th century, and certainly by the turn of the century, the pike was really beginning to take over from the halberd. The Battle of Sempach took place on July 9th of 1386, so this was definitely the later portion of the century. However, there are certain events or certain myths around the battle that would indicate that the Swiss were still relying on some of these shorter polearms. One of the most prominent, perhaps, myths from this engagement is the tale of Arnold von Winkelried. Now, this was supposedly a Swiss individual who threw himself upon the Habsburg pikes, threw himself upon the Austrian pikes, dragging them down, sort of hugging them, clutching them. We can see this in many varied depictions of the battle. Where he dragged down the pikes, opening a path for the Swiss forces to pour through and break through the Austrian pike formation. Now, whether or not this is myth, which is most likely the case, supposedly the earliest examples of this tale are the Lucerne Chronicle of 1513. Which is a solid 130 years after the event, and so whether or not this is a 100% accurate event is debatable. However, it would indicate some of the difficulties the Swiss had dealing with pike formations, and most likely explain why, if the Swiss were having so many issues in this situation, they began this shift away from halberds towards pikes. Now, another event that happened towards the turn of the 14th century and towards the 15th and then 16th centuries was the Swiss beginning to export their warfare or their mercenary skills to other nations. They began to export their mercenary services to kingdoms such as France. We saw their service in Italy, of course. Most famously now, the Papal Guard is still the Swiss Guard. But the Swiss began to export their services. And it is likely that as the Swiss began fighting on different battlefields, as they began fighting further afield, it may have also become evident that the halberd, while certainly an effective weapon, did have certain limitations when fighting on battlefields that were not hilly or muddy terrain, battlefields that were not essentially chosen ahead of time by the Swiss. For example, at the Battle of Sempach, the Swiss were very careful about choosing a terrain that was inconvenient for the Austrian cavalry, restricting its ability to effectively engage. And so throughout the 15th century, the halberd slowly became supplanted by the pike as the primary weapon of the Swiss Confederacy. However, it remained a supplementary weapon. It did not simply disappear. In many ways, it shared places with the Zweihänder, with the two-handed sword, as a more limited niche weapon. Oftentimes, pike formations would include, would have the have a front line, including a mass of pikes, then a small force of halberdiers, oftentimes defending the standard or persons of importance in this towards the center of the formation, ready to flex towards points of concern, ready to be a flexible reserve at the flanks, or supplement the push of pike, or dispatch cavalry that might have broken through the pike formation, because the halberds, of course, with their reverse spike, could pull cavalrymen from the horse, could potentially provide some additional armor-piercing oomph that the pikes were otherwise lacking. And then behind this formation, behind this group of halberds, would be a formation, again, would be more pikes, bringing up sort of the rear and providing additional support. So this support role was really the essentially the new meta for the halberd. It became a support weapon. While certainly not an equivalent of the greatsword, it did share sort of this supplementary function. In the case of push of pike, it could be deployed alongside the pikeman, where it was a shorter polearm, so it could be wielded with some accuracy and deftness amid a pike formation. Unlike a greatsword, which needed more room to maneuver and more room to swing the weapon around, this wasn't so much the case with the halberd. Certainly, it would be nice to swing the axe blade, but it wasn't necessary in the same way to get really good usage, the same way it was with the greatsword. The halberd, also supplementing in the interior of a formation for dragging down enemy cav, could also provide some additional flank support. Once again, protecting against enemy flanking maneuvers, or potentially the halberdiers could flank themselves. They could move along the outsides of the pike formation and pincer enemy pike formations. However, when it came to actually a sort of poking engagement where pikes were poking at one another, the halberd was certainly not well suited for that. It simply didn't have the reach. It also didn't really have the reach to engage cavalry effectively. Many people, I think, underestimate the length of a lance, and the lances would often have easily outreach a halberd. A footman with a halberd would not really stand much of a chance of engaging a heavily armored knight before he was on top. He was already stabbing him or impaling him with a lance. So this made the weapon less than ideal as on its own in a battlefield scenario. However, it continued to see much use. The halberd's popularity was noted by the German Landsknechts, by the German mercenaries, and they made significant use of the weapon. Now, as mentioned earlier in the greatsword video, the halberd saw some usage with the German Landsknechts in the Black Band, where 1,000 men of the 17,000 strong force were in fact armed with the halberd. Now, this was not a significant number necessarily compared to the 12,000 pikemen, or in fact 2,000 greatswords and 2,000 handgunners that were employed. However, it is still worth noting that it was a component of this force, and it was 1,000 men was still not necessarily a small number. It did mean that the halberd was retaining some prominence within these professional mercenary companies. The halberd continued to see significant service among the Swiss as well as the Germans, seeing a wide variety of conflicts throughout much of the 14th, as mentioned, but then into the 15th and 16th centuries. Some such examples included the Burgundian Wars. These took place between the years of 1474 and 1477, and it was in fact a halberd that proved the decisive weapon of this war when it struck down Charles the Bold of Burgundy, and effectively put an end to Burgundy as an independent duchy. Charles the Bold was struck down by some soldiery of the Swiss Confederation, Swiss infantry, as well as infantry from the Duchy of Lorraine, or men from the Duchy of Lorraine, managed to overwhelm Charles's forces, and As he was attempting to rally amid the retreat, he was supposedly struck in the head with a halberd. And well, that was that. That was Charles the Bold dead, and that put end to the Duchy of Burgundy. So, in that sense, the halberd proved history changing, and this wasn't its only example of being history changing. The English as well had picked up the halberd, and they made use of it in the War of the Roses, perhaps most significantly. And this wasn't the only conflict in which the English or these other made use of it. However, it was interesting because it was at the Battle of Bosworth Field where supposedly it is thought that Richard III was struck down with a halberd. Battle of Bosworth was, of course, the final major battle of the War of the Roses, during which the House of York was defeated by the Lancasters, by the Tudors, thus establishing the Tudor dynasty. And it was here that supposedly Richard III found himself brained with a halberd. This, once again, an interesting show of the halberd potentially having a prominent role to play in European battles. Now, from the 15th century, slowly going through into the 16th century, the halberd continued to decline in prominence. Now, in much the same vein as the greatsword, the halberd found itself steadily replaced by the rise of handguns, where previously many of the weaknesses of pike formations were covered by halberds and greatswords, and the pike was the primary weapon of pike formations, especially in Switzerland, as well as amongst German Landsknecht companies. Towards the 16th century, the handgun became a much more prominent tool, and ultimately supplanted them as at first an auxiliary weapon, but later became the primary way of breaking enemy pike formations. In fact, the pike really became a defensive tool for the handgun, and the handgun became the primary method of warfare, whereas previously the pike had been. And this evolution saw the halberd fall behind, and essentially saw it removed in large part from a battlefield role. Most major militaries would not use it in a sort of mass, in a mass role after the sort of mid 16th century. However, it continued to see some service as a bodyguard and sort of ceremonial weapon. For example, even as late as 1610, the English governor for Jamestown, Thomas West, arrived with 50 halberdiers. So this was 1610, and the halberd was still serving as a bodyguard weapon. Now, as we can see in the images, it had shifted from being a somewhat blunt force instrument, an instrument with a clear purpose and no frills, to being a rather ornate ceremonial tool. Certainly, it still retained some lethality and was still a weapon. However, it was shifting away from that original combat role, more in favor of the more towards service as a bodyguard and ceremonial tool. And in this ceremonial purpose, or in this mark of rank service, it continued to see function right up until the 18th centuries. In fact, the English only began replacing halberds as a tool, as an official tool for sergeants, in 1793, when they were replaced with pikes with crossguards or sergeant's spontoons. So that really does show sort of the longevity of the halberd in this ceremonial function. The halberd also remained a tool among militias. Many local militia forces and sort of town guards and such would remain armed with a halberd. And in fact, we saw as late as 1798 in the Battle of Grauholz. This was a battle during the French invasion of Switzerland in the wake of the French Revolution where the the Swiss militia and the Swiss civilians who came out to join the Swiss Bernese troops in defending their homes were in fact armed with these pole arms or various peasant tools, and we can see some of this in the images depicting the Swiss forces moving to engage the French. We can see that they are clearly not armed with the most up-to-date weaponry of the time. However, just an interesting note of sort of the last battles of the halberd. It goes without saying, the Battle of Grauholz was a defeat for the Swiss, a significant defeat, and certainly the halberd was not going to be winning any battles at this stage of history. However, it was a point, it still saw service, and I think that is worth mentioning. It's also worth noting that many of the ceremonial halberds, especially used among sergeants, such as the English sergeants, were no longer sharpened in some cases. They were no longer really meant to kill in some cases. They were simply meant to direct and to serve as a tool of office. This would especially be the case later with spontoons, but even some of the halberds were no longer of the sharpened variant. And this kind of does demonstrate, I think, the shift away from halberds as a practical weapon of war. Now, halberds continue to see some service as a ceremonial tool, most significantly, of course, by the Papal Guard, by the Swiss Guards. Though obviously, in this day and age, well, the Swiss Guard has its own guns. They just use the halberd ceremonially. Obviously, the halberd no longer serves much of a combat function in this day and age. Now, that's the history of the halberd in combat. It started off as a primary polearm, ultimately sort of evolving as a supplementary polearm, augmenting pike formations, acting as a support tool for larger formations of pike infantry, and ultimately sort of being relegated to bodyguard and local militia role. Now, in the world of Warhammer, a world that is in many ways more akin to a 15th, somewhere between a 14th and 16th century Europe, or the halberd would honestly be a decent weapon, once again in much the same vein as the greatsword. In the case of the Empire, but even the High or Dark Elves, there are many factions in the world of Warhammer that make use of the halberd. Chaos, of course. We see some of the Bretonnian polearms, all these weapons being utilized. I think in the world of Warhammer, the halberd is not necessarily a bad choice. Most factions do not have significance. Much of the infantry in the world is not significantly armed or significantly armored. So the halberd, with its somewhat mediocre armor-piercing performance, would not be a bad choice. Obviously, to counter, it does give you some additional reach, which is nice if you need to poke away at a big monster, or if you need to jab away at enemies from a safer distance. And of course, the hook on the back is good if you need to drag someone from the saddle, if you need to fight enemy cavalry. And as an augment to spear formation or a pike formation, it would be good. Now, weirdly enough, the world of Warhammer doesn't have pikes, so this is one thing where I find it kind of weird that the halberd. I guess in a world where you have no pikes, the halberd really can retain a significant level of prominence, because if you can't get outreached, at least by other infantry, that is a benefit. However, I do think that the halberd would not necessarily be ideal against some of the longer-reaching cavalry weapons in particular. Would probably be an issue. Would probably struggle a good bit against big monsters that could outreach the halberd. Sort of would in many cases overlap with the greatsword functionally, which I guess it did in real life to an extent, in that bodyguard and point defense sort of role. But I do think that from the sort of infantry combat perspective, the halberd would be a rather potent weapon in the world of Warhammer. For a faction like Empire in particular, as we discussed in the case of the Greatsword, most of the Empire's opponents are not well armored. The halberd could drag cavalry from the saddle, So definitely a useful niche there. And of course, you can jab and poke at enemies from a safe distance. Similar case for the elves. Most of the many of the elf troops are not particularly well armored. Many of them are rather lightly armored. So in that case, just having more reach and being able to slash and land a brutal blow can be effective. For chaos troops who are fighting down against Empire State troops a lot of the time who are not well armored, the halberd could be a very useful weapon. And obviously you still retain that rear spike, which can give you some extra oomph against armor, which is not bad to have. Now, is the halberd fairly depicted as an armor-piercing weapon in the world of Warhammer? I think that's a little bit debatable. The halberd, while not the worst anti-armor weapon, certainly, it was also not a specialized anti-armor weapon. Something like a poleaxe, it's much more of a legitimate armor-piercing weapon, and it's pretty clear the halberds in the world of Warhammer are not poleaxes. The blades are far too large. They don't have the rear hammer involved, and they're clearly not designed to be really armor-piercing weapons. So in that case, halberd shouldn't really be an armor-piercing weapon. It's limited. It's kind of a hybrid, but certainly not in the realm of like a poleaxe. If you really needed to deal with armor, you'd want a poleaxe, and that's not what you get. So just an interesting point, I think, to be made there, that the halberd's representation is a little awkward in many ways. It's strange that the world of Warhammer doesn't really have much in the way of pike formations. It's weird that sort of the halberd is represented as an AP tool. I guess that's a similar case with the greatsword. It's why are these weapons armor piercing? Because they say so. I don't know. But either way, some fun food for thought there. So I do hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hope you found it informative and hopefully at least a little bit entertaining. As usual, leave your thoughts, comments, or additional insights down below. If you have any personal requests or questions about future historical videos, feel free to ask. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts. And if you guys pitch interesting ideas, I'll be more than happy to go ahead and make some videos on various historical topics. So I do thank you all for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.